Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for your patience while we're getting all of these webinar issues ironed out. But it's going to be worth the wait. This is a really exciting event today. Just to introduce myself, I'm Erin Height-Forsyth, the Associate Director of the Rock Ethics Institute. I'm also an Associate Professor in the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Department here at Penn State. And on behalf of the Rock Ethics Institute, as well as the Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, I'd like to welcome you all to Transcare, a critical conversation, as well as the exciting panelists that we have today, Hil Malatino, Ann Cvetkovich, and Jules Gill-Peterson. We are so thrilled to have all of you here for what will be a really exciting conversation. I'm just gonna do a few short bios for everybody in case folks here don't know so much about your backgrounds. I'll start with you, Hil, my colleague, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies here at Penn State, as well as a research associate at the Rock Ethics Institute. Dr. Malatino's research and teaching draws upon trans and intersex studies, critical sexuality studies, transnational feminisms, disability studies, and medical ethics to theorize how experiences of violence, trauma, and resilience play out in intersex, trans, and gender nonconforming lives. He's the author of 2 books, Queer Embodiment, which was published by the University of Nebraska Press in 2019, and the subject of today's panel, Transcare, which was published by the University of Minnesota Press just in September. Transcare offers a critical intervention in how care labor and care ethics have been thought, arguing that dominant modes of conceiving and critiquing the politics and distribution of care entrench normative and ciscentric familial structures and gendered arrangements. So 2 books in a really short amount of time, Hil, congratulations. We're also privileged to be joined by Ann Cvetkovich, who's currently the director of the Pauline Jewett Institute of Women's and Gender Studies at Carleton University, all the way in Ottawa, Canada. She's the author of Mixed Feelings, Feminism, Mass Culture, and Victorian Sensationalism out of Rutgers in 1992, An Archive of Feelings, Trauma, Sexuality, and Lesbian Public Cultures, published by Duke in 2003, and Depression, A Public Feeling, also published by Duke in 2012. She co-edited Public Sentiments, a special issue of The Scholar and Feminist Online, and Political Emotions, which was published in 2010. She's also been the co-editor of GLQ, a journal of lesbian and gay studies. And her current writing projects focus on the current state of LGBTQ archives and the creative use of them by artists to create counter-archives and interventions in public history. We're also very lucky to be joined by Jules Gill-Peterson, who's an associate professor of English and gender, sexuality, and women's studies at the University of Pittsburgh. Jules is the author of Histories of the Transgender Child, which was published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2018, which is the first book to shatter the widespread myth that transgender children are a brand new generation in the 21st century. Jules is currently at work on a book project entitled Gender Underground, A History of Trans DIY, which reframes the trans 20th century not through institutional medicine, but through the do-it-yourself practices of trans people that forge parallel medical and social worlds of transition. So for today's panel, we're going to start with Hil, who'll give us an overview of his new book, followed by a conversation between Hil, Ann, and Jules. And we'll be reserving the last half hour for question and answer, which I'll be moderating. I ask you to please submit any questions that you have to the Q&A box. I'll be monitoring that mostly for questions, and that you can submit questions throughout the event. I'll be looking at them the entire time. So thanks everybody for joining us today. And thank you so much to the panelists for joining us. We're really privileged to have you all here.
So, hey y'all. Thank you so much for joining us on this very important day in transmasc history. I'm sure as many of you know, right, we're celebrating the addition of a very famous new Eliot to a long line of Eliots. So that is great, but I'm happy you made time in your schedule to join us for this conversation. And who knows, maybe Eliot's with us. That would be a blessing. I also wanted to call attention to the fact that at the very top of the chat, I dropped a link to a campaign that's being currently run by Trans Lifeline called Until We're All Free. It's the new iteration of what they used to call their Holiday Commissary Fund. So they raise money every year for folks' commissaries and also for people's bail funds. So I encourage you all to donate to that if you've got some money. And I guess I'll just jump into talking about the genesis of the book. But also before I do that, I wanted to say how thankful I am that Jules and Ann are here with us today. And with me in particular. I love both of their work is amazing, transformative, hugely important for my own thinking, and also just hugely important, of course, on its own terms. So Ann, I remember reading An Archive of Feelings when I was probably somewhere, I don't know, it was a midpoint in graduate school, and thinking, yeah, this is exactly the kind of shit that I want to do, right? This is like an approach to the archive, the question of the archive, and an approach to thinking through questions of trauma and feeling that was so deeply resonant for me. And I've been trying to sort of live up to the promise of your work, I think, in my own scholarship for years. And then Jules, you and I approached the same archives, or at least overlapping archives, probably for the last decade, with really, really resonant and similar concerns, trying to do counter readings of these really traumatic trans and intersex medical archives. And there's kind of no other person I would want to sort through questions of trans care with. And also both of you, right, sort through questions of the archive and what it means to have what's maybe a reparative approach to sometimes deeply traumatic archives. So, all right, Trans Care. That book came about sort of around the time, the idea for the book came about around the time I started this job I currently have at Penn State. So as most of you know, I'm an assistant professor at Penn State in women's gender and sexuality studies. I started the job about my fourth year. So a little over 3 years ago, I began. And when I began the job, there was a lot of hullabaloo that some of you might remember about a particular faculty member at Penn State who came to be known for having a relatively transphobic approach to classroom dynamics that included sort of willfully misgendering students. So that was occurring at the very same time that I started. And my first, as if like starting a tenure track job isn't stressful enough, I was sort of confronted with this question, well, how do I, as one of the sort of lone trans academics at this institution, begin to deal with and sort of care for some of the students who have experienced the fallout from this particular, this particular cluster. So I began thinking like what it means to care both pedagogically and interpersonally for younger trans folks, for trans academics that are early career, et cetera, in a context of sort of virulent institutional transphobia. And then my thinking about that sort of spiraled out to thinking about broader questions regarding how trans folks actually cultivate in and through sort of building community with one another, dynamics of strategic resilience, right, that make trans lives more livable. So that was the germ of the book. And it also means that the book was grounded in a whole set of pretty bad feelings. There was, I think, fatigue and outrage that I was personally experiencing as a result of sort of climates of institutional transphobia and the way they seem so recalcitrant and difficult to address at the individual and interpersonal level, and also at the collective level. There was also fatigue, just the sort of fatigue that comes along with being a minoritized person who's an early career person also in academia, and the way that trans scholars in particular have been sort of called on for very, very extensive service labor. I think that's the case for all of the trans academics I know, sort of regardless of the point they're at in their careers, but especially early career folks, and even really graduate students. I've seen lots of graduate students be asked to carry a sort of undue service labor burden that is almost entirely unremunerated. And that's troubling to me, right? So I began to be preoccupied with how to shift institutional climates in academia as a result of this. But then also, right, more broadly, I became concerned with the question of trans care. And I approached that, I guess, in an intensive way in conversation with Aaron Azura. He and I taught the summer school that the Society for the Study of Affect ran a couple of years ago. And that summer school was called We Care a Lot, which is the title of a Faith No More song, which sort of dates me and outs me in a really nerdy way. And the subtitle was Theorizing Queer and Trans Affective Labor. And when we composed this sort of intensive summer seminar, we were trying to bring together a few different strands of thought, in particular an engagement with Marxist feminist theorizations of reproductive labor, trying to bring that into conversation with feminist care ethics. And my background is in philosophy, so I'd read a lot of feminist care ethics and also read it kind of hypercritically because it seemed to take a sort of heteronormative familial model of care, and the distribution of care is its core, is the place it from, even though it began from, it began to theorize the politics of care there in a really critical way. That was still where it started. So it always struck me as radically inadequate. And I was trying to think about the limitations of that body of work, but also the promise. Some of those concepts really still hold, I think. And we were putting both of those strains of thought into conversation with contemporary writing on care work, and particularly Leah Lakshmi Piepzina and Samarasena's work, the book Care Work that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, and the concept of care webs that she develops in that work. So it was just a whole lot that we were pouring into the seminar and trying to sort out what trans care labor actually looks like, how care labor and maybe reproductive labor more broadly circulates in trans lives. And one of our hunches, and I think that this is definitely true, it turns out that it circulates in very different ways than it does in the lives of heterosexual folks and the lives of people who are not trans. So yeah, the book started there, and then I'm not sure how many of you all have gotten to read the book. It's very short, it's 72 pages, it's a little baby book. And it's also open access. So if you haven't read it and you want to read it, it is available for free online at any point in time. But yeah, trans care is basically the sort of trace of my grappling with this sort of mess of intellectual genealogies and trying to think through what, in real on the ground terms, trans care labor looks like, and how the models we have for thinking about how care circulates are inadequate, right? Don't do justice to that kind of labor. And that's for a few different reasons, and I'll wrap this up sort of quickly. One has to do with the fact that I think trans care labor happens through networks of really dispersed intimacies. So its primary node is not necessarily domestic, even though many trans people occupy more or less traditional domestic sort of configurations. Certainly not all, and probably not even the majority, right? Some do. But there's still this phenomenon of sort of having an extensive care web that is, I don't know, maybe stretches across the nation state, stretches transnationally, and the folks you lean on for support emotionally and really pragmatically, maybe even economically, are not necessarily the folks that you find in your household, whatever your configuration your household might have. So I was trying to think through that. And I was also trying to think through what I came to call a T for T praxis of love, right? So thinking of love as a specific praxis, and thinking about what feminist philosopher Sarah Ruddick has called preservative love, which is the kind of love that basically enables us to survive. And normally we associate that with the maternal, right? And that results in a kind of unfair and extractive relationship to maternal care labor. But then I also began to think, well, what are the ways in which we're all sort of like mothering or parenting, right, one another in the context of providing preservative love for one another, right? So yeah, that. And let me look at my notes and see. I think the other preoccupation I had in the book was how to develop a politics of citation that was also a praxis of care. So I started off with a sort of like hard rule that I only wanted to cite trans people in the book. That became a little, I don't know, maybe idealistic. It turns out there are lots of folks that I wanted to cite at the end of the day who were queer and maybe not trans. So, but I still had that, the sort of tendency to turn towards trans scholars, which also meant turning towards sort of gray academic publishing, because so many trans scholars are currently not publishing with major presses, not necessarily being published in journals other than TSQ, or even in TSQ for that matter. So yeah, the citational politics of the book is important to mention. It's something I wanted to sort of hit at the outset of this conversation. And then the last bit I wanted to talk about was burnout. So burnout's a kind of centerpiece of the book. I didn't necessarily intend for it to be a centerpiece of the book, but as I looked at archival traces and testimonies that had to do with trans care work, or what Rupert Raj calls voluntary gender work or voluntary gender labor, which I thought was really funny and sort of on the nose. Although the question of how voluntary it is, I think, is up for debate and maybe something we should talk about. I kind of realized that most trans folks were deeply burnt out, and that care labor was sort of the crux of that burnout. So it became necessary to theorize both what burnout is, how it manifests in trans lives, but also maybe some of the limitations of how burnout tends to be conceptualized and thought about, especially now that it's become this sort of like generalized millennial phenomenon and discussed as such, as symptomatic of what's happened in the context of multiple recessions, the ascendancy of neoliberalism, the divestment of the welfare state, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll stop rambling there and see what Jules and Ann have to say.
Thanks, Hil. And I don't know I guess we never decided. I mean, I know we're all going to talk, but I have like a really short thing I'd love to say. And then if you want to say, okay, great. We've done these things before. Thanks, Hil. It's like, I can't even express what a joy it is to be here. And I assume it's equally as snowy where you are in Pennsylvania as where I am. So it's been a really cozy day for me. I have like a faux fur blanket on right now. And what a treat. You mentioned an archive of feelings being a really signal text for you in graduate school. And not to date myself as very young, but for me, it was an undergrad. I read an archive of feelings, and it blew my mind. And I had the exact same feeling where I was like, oh shit, this is it. So thank you. It's really a very special feeling to be in conversation. And I just had really something really short that I just kind of, I guess I'll read, and maybe it will become clear why. So I wanted to say that Trans Care, I think, is a book that delivers nothing short of a sensibility for being trans in 2020, but also in 2021 when that comes, which is to say the strange situation of being exhausted and alive. Exhausted as in we've been damn tired for decades, if not centuries. Alive as in not yet living well, but not yet dead either. And we, as in a pronoun that actually can't work for what it would paper over and homogenize, and yet feels a certain way, crisp, as in the rhythms of the great trans agora called social media that brings us memes to soften the blow of our ongoing status as the targets of the most excruciating politics of hate. That feels a certain way when it brings us TERFs, racism, and chasers instead, and intramural fights over everything and everyone, and the blood-curdling need for care that's being voiced but not met. That feels a certain way when it comes to trying to get to see a doctor under quarantine when every kind of medical care you need is now deemed inessential. And it feels a certain way, both banal and yet impossibly deep, when there's a virus that impersonally kills, and yet kills with deadly human accuracy along vectors of race and class. I've never encountered academic work quite like Hil's in this book, which slices deep into the structure of feeling of that millennial Generation Z cusping thing we call the discourse, or the culture of contemporary trans life. It's piercing, it's disarming, it's an instantly referential and essential book. The Forerunners series at Minnesota Press styles itself as for thought in process, for ideas yet to congeal, and for what must be thought in its urgency at a pace that matches a problem in the world. Trans Care answers that urgency, but with a wisdom and an ethos of care that makes it anything but rushed thinking. And there's so much that I want to say, in so many ways I want to express gratitude for how Hil comes to massively under-theorized and under-thought moments of collective trans witnessing and gifts us a language, a vocabulary, and a set of concepts for thinking about them. Trans Care is the kind of adorable, lovable, and readable little book that one consumes with great hunger in a single sitting before passing it on to a friend or a lover or a comrade who needs it. I think it's like our trans little yellow book. But this passage to an epic of mutual aid adequate to the situation of contemporary trans life is, I want to acknowledge, shot through with profound difficulty, one that Hil has handled so beautifully, it gave me no short of goosebumps, giggles, and tears as I read. I'm hung up on the very beginning of the book on that queer and trans care web, since it's one that joins me to Hil, to Ann, and to each of you who are here today. So Hil writes, quote, "This is the gauntlet thrown down by any sustained attempt to collectively cultivate a care web. It challenges us to be deliberate, to communicate capacity, to unlearn the shame that has become so attached to asking for, offering, and accepting help when we've been full body soaked and steeped in the mythos of neoliberal entrepreneurial self-making. It asks us to think carefully about what constitutes good care." I can't seem to escape this passage lately, and it's because I've been ill. This strange year of 2020 is ending for me with a revolving door of doctors, of inconclusive tests, and with an intense dose of medical transphobia. As I've been in and out of seeing my doctor, masked and worried about possible COVID exposure, and as I fought over every medical professional's inability to diagnose reproductive conditions in trans women, and as I've had to manage a terrible side effect from one antibiotic and the even worse effect of being told casually by my doctor that I should just detransition for 2 months so I can take a different one. In all this, I've only made it through relatively intact and able to be here with you today because of the trans care I have been given, largely by a trans partner who has soothed my fears and let me cry on his shoulder, who comes to my doctor's appointments with me to make sure I'm not mistreated, and who reminds me that my shame in needing help and the pain of having to seek it from phobic institutions says less about who I am than the world in which we have to make a life in. The interval of that smaller world built between the two of us, that interval of trans care, is the one that has kept me more than just exhausted and alive these past few weeks. Now, I'll admit I have a fever right now, so who knows what I'm gonna say after I go off script. That Hil has taken the remarkably difficult and endemic conditions in which so many trans people live and made of them a roadmap with our predecessors in struggle, a roadmap to our collective and mutual forms of solidarity and affection, and really a book that is in many ways an incantation of our collective capacities, which is to say our power. For that, I offer nothing but gratitude and joy in being with you here today, Hil, and with your remarkable book and with this rich community that it has clearly brought together. So that's what I wanted to say. I'll turn it over to you, Ann.
Ooh, that was good. Thank you. I didn't write a text because I was dreaming of a sort of impromptu conversation, which I think we can definitely have, but it's nice to also have some words on the page. So thank you for that, Jules. And thank you also to both of you for the introduction by way of Archive of Feelings. I mean, there's nothing more gratifying than having people you don't know read your work and take it up. And for me, one of the, what my girlfriend calls magical reception, one of the forms of magical reception, which I think trans care is going to get some magical reception today. Hopefully we can provide that for you, Hil. But one particularly kind of gratifying reception for those of us who are in academia is to feel like our work facilitates that of younger scholars coming up. And I think too, we've now kind of identified ourselves transgenerationally. And so for there to be a conversation transgenerationally is so important for this issue of trans care, given, for example, the way Hil reaches back into the archive to find fellow travelers, not, without difficulty and sort of strange relations being produced or ambivalent relations. So given also, Hil, the way you describe the citational practice, right? And I think there's a point in the book where you talk about forms of trans separatism, which I totally get, like that can be so important to have those lateral kind of insider networks. I also do feel honored to be here today in order to have a conversation that might be across different generations and different identity categories. And especially important given the turf tensions, which have been extremely distressing to me, and the way that I think that has gotten in the way of what might otherwise be different kinds of care webs, where lesbian feminisms, butch femme, gender non-normativities, et cetera, could be talking to each other and nurturing each other. And as Hil points out, the webs are so fragile and often so, I think, as they put it, threadbare, that we need, you know, all the all the help we can get. So to be able to create those liaisons is really important. I wanted to also begin with two sort of preamble notes. One is a form of land acknowledgement to say I'm coming to you from Algonquin territory, and I think we're kind of speaking across the broader, let's say, Great Lakes area. And so our territories are connected. And I do think that care of the land is one of the important sort of root places from which to learn relations of care for each other. So the land acknowledgement for me today is important in that respect. And indeed, Hil also points out the way in which care webs or different understandings of how we care for each other, not often laterally rather than across power relations, are about interdependence, right? So that interdependence we're coming to learn and know, whether from Indigenous ways of knowing or other ways of knowing, entails our relation also to the non-human or to the land. And if we get better, if we're better practiced at doing that, maybe we can also better take care of each other. Although sometimes, kind of to invoke Lauren Berlant on the inconvenience of others, it may be that the human-human relations are sometimes the hardest ones. And so being able to form relations with animals, with the non-human is one way to learn or to be protected in places where we feel like people have consistently let us down or betrayed us. So that's that's what I get from land acknowledgement today. And then also, this is December 1st, which in some circles is become to be known as World AIDS Day. It began as a day without art. And that shift to that larger category is one that, you know, comes with a certain massification. In order to situate myself generationally as a product of 1980s HIV/AIDS activism, pro-sex feminisms, and reclaimings of the word queer, I'm actually wearing an archival t-shirt. It's an original from Queer Nation, New York City, circa around 1990. Yeah, just wanting to kind of give that shout out as well, because pretty much everything interesting I know about care in kind of, you know, non-normative ways comes from taking care of people who died. So just kind of that memorial moment. Some of the ways in which Hil references critiques of Transgender Day of Remembrance might be relevant here too, about ways in which mourning can be its own kind of black hole or point of no return. So trying to figure out how to use those, you know, those days of the year when in fact they are, you know, perpetual is another perhaps challenge in learning care. So yeah, those things were kind of framing my thinking about, or kind of living with this book over the last few days, happily so. And again, to think that like the struggle that I've had to produce my work could then make it possible for other people to push the envelope further is great. Like I love these baby books that people are producing. And I love the way in which Hil weaves together forms of lived experience with forms of theoretical knowledge. So I think, Hil, one of the things that's wonderful is the way that you are inventing a method that is able to draw on what you call like the transmundane, like the everyday of trans existence, to produce work that is not only of great scholarly merit, and that's no small thing, right? Because part of what we're trying to do is create institutional legitimacy, particularly given, Hil, what you were saying about the expansion of trans lives into academia still being sometimes at a fledgling state where it's a lot of grad students, undergrads, younger scholars who are having to bear a disproportionate burden of doing the kind of care labor institutionally that happens in other contexts as well. At the same time, you know, in addition to being a very powerful baby book, little little yellow book, in terms of its scholarly power, I do think trans care is also like equipment for living, like it's a book that helps with survival. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to get to my little PowerPoint quotations, but I did want people to gaze upon some of the words. Maybe I will. Is that okay if I go to that? Because that would be a way, Hil, to then like pass it back to you and have you, like if we all could meditate on some of these phrases that have been really powerful to me, that might be one way to go back over to you. So let's see if I can do I have power to share screen? I hope so.
Erin should have the PowerPoint though.
Yeah, I'm happy to share it, and just
okay.
let me know when you'd like me to go to the next slide.
Yeah, why don't you go to that one that says Arts of Living, just because, yeah, that way we have any, I can be reading and then it'll come up so people can just kind of, I love just like having these keywords to live with. And there's a lot of great ones in this book. So this is from very early on in the opening pages. There's a paragraph that begins, I'm interested in how we survive this, how we cultivate arts of living that make us possible. That is such a great phrase. And you know, my work, especially in depression, is all about the arts of everyday living. So I really resonate to this, that make us possible in a culture that is alternatingly, depending on where you're at or who you are, either thinly accommodating, love that phrase, again, because accommodation institutionally can just be so limited, or devastatingly hostile. How are we showing up for each other? And showing up is another phrase that is at the very end of the book that I would love to hear Hil kind of talk about how he might have come to that phrase, why it became so important. How are we showing up for each other, and how come it sometimes feels so hard to do so? Just that right there is very powerful. And especially in this moment, you know, where we're like 9 months into pandemic, going into winter solstice mode, it's dark. I'm like, not around it can't have face-to-face with my friends. And so all the things we've ever learned about caring for each other are so on the table right now. So, you know, this is also an opportunity to maybe have a conversation about that. So I'll pause there and like bounce it back over to you and or Jules.
Hil, you're still muted.
Good, because I was just kind of mumbling my way into beginning a response, so you all didn't have to hear that.
Oh.
And it's hard to know where to start, given that, you know, you both said such sort of beautiful, and in a way it's hard for me to hear the really nice things about the book, because I think, you know, we're just so used to being in this critical mode in relationship to our own work, whatever, and bad at taking compliments generally. But I will say thank you to both of you for that commentary. And maybe we can just jump into that first slide of yours, Anne. and think through showing up both in the context of this pandemic, right? Just before the winter solstice and the dark time of the year, in a very dark year. I was reading, as I'm sure a lot of other people are right now, Dean Spade's new little book, another little book on mutual aid. And there is a slogan that he takes, I forget from which organization, but it's one of the chapters in the book, and it's called No Masters, No Flakes. And I think when I talk about showing up, it's very much in the spirit of, in that spirit, right? In the spirit of mutual aid, in the spirit of people who are doing actual organizing on the ground, right? Where the work only gets done if people actually show up to do the work. And the work, I mean, can be treated as this abstract phenomenon, but it's actually really just this nuts and bolts, very unsexy, very pragmatic set of labors that keeps people alive, enables folks to sort of get through the day, get through the year, et cetera. And I think that when I think about what makes trans lives possible, right, it is that really, really sort of mundane labor. And I've tried to situate trans care and also this new big book, that not baby book, maybe one day a grown up book that I'm working on, sort of between the poles of dysphoria and euphoria. There's been so much conversation about like the limits of a trans discourse that's focused on the dysphoric. And I have a ton of sympathy with that. Not just because of the negativity that is associated with dysphoria, but also because of how highly sort of individuated people tend to think about dysphoria. And then the antidote to that for some folks has been this turn to euphoria. And for me, that's not a particular, that's sort of like, I don't know, are we thinking about dysphoria and euphoria in this binary? Also, life doesn't feel very either euphoric or dysphoric on a day-to-day basis, kind of at all. And yeah, sure, there are moments of joy, there are moments of euphoria, but that's never enough to sort of serve as an antidote or fully ameliorate the kinds of just banal exhaustion that I think are at the core of so much of my own experience that obviously filters into the book. And neither is dysphoria, right? Like I don't want to write or talk about my own personal experiences of dysphoria. I can, but it's not particularly illuminating. It's kind of garden variety and it sucks. So that's, I mean, is there anything really much more I can say that's interesting about that? I don't think so. So this commitment to the mundane, right, and my attempts to theorize the mundane is actually just, you know, a way of thinking about how we do this boring, unsexy work of showing up for each other and the forms that that takes, right? And in the context of this pandemic, this is particularly poignant to me because every year for like the last decade, my partner and I have hosted what we call Queersgiving as a sort of alternative to, you know, the holiday that happened last week. And it started in part because we lived in East Tennessee and there were a lot of students that we worked with at East Tennessee State University, this sort of mid-sized regional university I used to be the assistant director of women's studies at, that weren't able to go home for the holidays or would go home and then would be so heavily traumatized by what happened at their familial homes that they would need a like safety valve or outlet or release after. And this is in Southern Appalachia, and this is not to propagate myths about Southern Appalachia, but you know, some families are very, very deeply homophobic and transphobic there and everywhere else. So we started this sort of holiday celebration, and this year we obviously couldn't do it because of the pandemic. So our alternative was really just to import the gentleman who is the character in the coda of trans care, who's like my lifelong bestie, who I think is here. I think he might be watching this. And then he got COVID he tested positive for COVID about a week before he was set to sort of very safely journey up to us. And that was, you know, sort of devastating, but also I'm in an extremely privileged context in relation to the pandemic. I can work remotely. You know, I have a sort of on the ground support network in State College, Pennsylvania, where I'm at. And I just thought like how brutal it is for so many other folks who don't even have this ability to import one person or have this sort of very just digitally mediated, awful, I don't know, experience of the current moment. And showing up in that context becomes incredibly difficult. Like who do you pod with? Who do you make a decision to pod with in the context of these really dispersed intimacies, especially if you don't have folks you can turn to and be like, we're mimicking a familial unit in this moment. I don't know if other folks would like to respond to that? Maybe Jules, because a lot of what you said sort of touched on this too.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think that part of what the pandemic has done, right, is it's tried to privatize social action, or, social behavior, like social distancing. It obviously has legitimate value. I wish it was, actually a norm. But, another thing that it does is sort of realize an ultimate fantasy of neoliberal subjectivity, that you would just privatize, behavior so deeply that, everyone would live in pods or apart, or, these sorts of fantasies that everyone can stay at home, right? Which, I think part of the thing that has been really painful. I mean, there's a couple of things I want to say. I don't want to turn this into a panel about the pandemic, but yeah, someone on something else I was speaking on recently was talking about how different memorialization culture and culture around death is in this pandemic versus in the AIDS epidemic, and how there really doesn't seem to be much of a culture of public mourning. I mean, public, right, obviously having to be, put under erasure for lots of reasons, but yeah, but there's not really that much discussion of deaths, and then, so it's like, why are there no, I think I saw an image of body bags like today by accident on the internet, and I was like, well, it's actually weird to me. I haven't seen that since New York was the epicenter. But so that's one thing that's weird. Yeah, and I think that institutions are acting really bizarrely, right? Because this is meant to be temporary, even if it's meant to remake structural things and transfer a huge amount of wealth to the top, right? Like the university, one thing I've just been so taken aback by, from all universities, but especially mine, is just this incredible presumption that the faculty won't get sick and die, that we just somehow won't. And I don't know why they think that. There are faculty who are sick at my university. My university decided to reopen when there were more cases than ever in the county than there had ever been before. I don't know why it thought that was smart. So in any case, there are some strange aspects to the privatization aspect. And I think that puts a lot of pressure on people who are already marginalized and can't, fall back on a nuclear heteronormative family, property structure, right? Basically to bail yourself out. And that can be as literal as unemployment versus, no unemployment benefits, but it also, I think, really is true in terms of care, right? Like I have this sort of running joke in my life that, I live alone, which I'm very happy about, but that my neighbors, perhaps as they very politely watched me transition over the last year, have also noted that every few months I seem to import a mask from another state who comes and stays for a while and, inevitably mows my lawn, probably fixes something on my car. Those would be the most polite things that they would maybe notice. But in any case, like there's a lot behind that kind of joke, I mean, I really, yeah, being ill lately, with a non-COVID illness has really made me think a lot about that while I've been, finishing the semester, because there's actually really no plan to not finish the semester. And I've been thinking a lot about this week as I've been grading students who could really submit anything they wanted. Like, don't write anything, doesn't have to be intellectual. I got all this great art, but it's been kind of fun and really moving actually to sort of sit with students. And I asked them in their self-assessments to talk about, what was it like doing this work this semester? Because as part of my accountability as an instructor, but it was just hard to listen to. This is a class of like 90% trans students, by the way. It was just painful, to listen to all of the situations that a lot of them were going through. Anyways, that was a lot of free association. The one thing I really wanted to say that I think is really important about trans care as a book here, right, is that trans doesn't function as an identitarian category in this book. It's not something we have in common due to our state of being, right? Rather, what makes people trans in this book is how they care for one another, right? It's a common patterned experience of marginalization and oppression and resilience that forms a social bond and forms an ethic and a possibility, right? That's, to me, it's a shift from sort of trans as a question of being or ontology to trans as a set of actions or doing, right? And I think that that's something that's really beautiful and is quite a gift for trans studies, but also feels especially poignant right now, since so much so much fuss that comes our way, and so much, I mean, there's something I'd love to talk about with you both, which is negativity and negative affect. It's really painful as someone else that was, one of the few trans people in a tenure track job, that managed to get tenure, and just like sitting and looking upon the wasteland and feeling like, wow, I wish I even had the kind of power that could respond to the anger and outpour that I feel from people I love and people I don't even know who work in the field, who are underemployed, who are graduate students, who are staring down the future and are clamoring, right? Rightly so clamoring. And now, as like a few of us have, very, very difficultly, under a lot of duress, with a lot of personal pain and sacrifice, like managed to eke out like jobs for our individual selves, we don't even have anything to give. Like, we have nothing to redistribute, right? If I work in a literal gigantic skyscraper, if I could disassemble that tower and hand it out, I mean, nothing would make me happier. But in fact, that's not the position we find ourselves in. I just went through a huge fight with my institution over this, where I was like, you love me because I do symbolic value for you. And the convenience that you hired me before I transitioned is that now you can say you have a trans member who you tenured. And so therefore your university couldn't possibly be transphobic, when in fact we know it is massively transphobic, and you're deliberately using me to cover over transphobia. So one thing I want to think about, though, is like how that manifests in this year, where social media is really our public again in a more intense way, because we're not getting together, and how we're dealing with just so much anger and pain, and how we're trying to offer care, and how that works generationally. I mean, there's so many ways we could slice or dice this conversation, but it just felt really moving to me. Rereading the book and thinking about just, the 100 years we've all lived this year together. I'm just talking about Twitter. Like it's been a year on Twitter, right? So like, what are we to do with that, I guess, is one thing I'm thinking about. How do we show up and show care for each other? I mean, I love Morgan M. Page's rule that like she doesn't publicly fight with any trans person on the internet. That's not how she deals with conflict. But also, what about grievance? I just feel like trans studies is full of grievance, and it's not wrong, right? It's not wrong. Those grievances are right. They are spot fucking on. But I feel mystified about really what it is we can do. I think the lesson from your book, though, is that you can't really do that much as an individual. It has to be collective, right? It has to be something collective. But just thinking about where we are right now, I don't know if either of you have thoughts on just, that was a real mishmash. Like I said, I have kind of a high fever, so sorry.
We're Hil, do you want to respond, or I have an idea that maybe we could move it forward by going to one of my other slides. Would that work?
Yeah, I'm totally into that. I just want to say really quickly that I really appreciate what you said, Jules, about my refusal to sort of conceptualize trans in identitarian terms. It's not just because I was sort of schooled in post-structuralist philosophy at all. It's actually because I find debates about the ontology of trans beingness so fucking tedious and kind of besides the point. Like, those are stultifying and soporific conversations that actually prevent us from having compelling dialogue, right? And actually building and I feel like TERF discourse does this, but it's not the only thing that does this, because Lord knows I've had plenty of debates about the ontology of transness with people who are definitely not TERFs. But when the focus is on the beingness of transness, it means that every other interesting conversation is just shut down, right? So like rejecting the ontological turn regarding transness is a sort of fancy way of putting it. I'm fully on board with. I think it's something worth committing to sort of en masse. But yes, Anne, for sure, go ahead to another slide.
Well, I'm thinking, Erin, I think you have the slide, so I'm just thinking briefly to look at the second one, just so people have in mind like this set of terms that's burnout, exhaustion, like all the stuff that we've just been talking about as very much, up and running for many, many people in this pandemic moment. But I think it's important to remember that this is the everyday experience of, certain kinds of bodies and certain kinds of lives. So both of you have described, what it can be like institutionally to bear the burden of being a trans person. And I'm thinking too that these last months have been really important for a new level of visibility for the burdens that scholars of color also carry representationally. So I love, for example, I got my Edie Fake here, what Hil does with this notion of abstraction and kind of different ways in which we might want to be represented that might also distribute representation across a range of bodies and lives. So there's much more we could say about these categories as they occupy us in the academy. Although I think, Hil, you referenced this, I do think one key origin for the book, and that's really interesting for me also in our conversations, which aren't even that old, but I was so lucky to be in that seminar that you and Aaron organized. And I think I see Greg Seaworth, so shout out to Greg in the guest list for making that capacious space. But, activist burnout, exhaustion, compassion fatigue, all these things, like trying to find the vocabulary to talk about the exhaustion that activists often feel is very important for my work with the Public Feelings group that again comes out of HIV/AIDS activism and political depression as an activist category. And I've just been so excited to see younger activists, whether it's the disability justice that Leah Peepsna Samarasinha writes about, or the trans care work, or the movement for Black Lives focus, especially coming from queer and feminist angles on self-care and collective care. Dean Spade's work on mutual aid, which of course comes out of work in trans communities, but is having a broad reach. All of that really, really important. But there's something about Hil about at one point, I think you call it the gorgeous messiness of trans lives. So your willingness to get in there with what's like complicated, I really appreciate. So that takes me to the next slide, Erin, if you could put it up. That's from this little section that I just love so much, in part because we share a love of Linda Berry as inspiration for writing. And in fact, I've been doing workshops in pandemic time that use this piece that the New York Times published, in which she draws spirals in order to then generate words for like, how did we get here? And so Hil writes about failing in this exercise of Linda Berry's that entails being able to record or draw overheard speech, and not being able to remember overheard speech, and realizing that it may come from a sort of defensive or self-protective strategy for withdrawal and escape. And he asked, how often do we strategically muffle our sensorium to get through a situation? That question just blew me away. I was just like, wow. Thank you for naming that. I may not come to that from specifically trans experience, but it's something, anybody who's kind of dealing with like body, mind, world, and the senses and stuff, you just like really nail something that's so important. And so then you go on to say, later in that section, this means that caring for us and our practice of caring for one another is not a simple task. We're sometimes swaddled thick in completely justified defenses. We might not be able to hear you or each other very well at all. I love that. I invite you to comment further, just because it speaks to like the kind of high maintenance nature of some of our friends we care for. Like, it's not easy doing that work. Those of us also who are teaching, especially teaching vulnerable students, trans students, students of color, underrepresented groups. Yeah, it's a lot of work. And we get tired, and they wear us out. And yet that's how it is. So for me, I'm also thinking about this in terms of, and shout out to Grayson Hunt, my former colleague at UT, who's I think in the guest list. Grayson and I worked together creating the LGBTQ studies program at University of Texas, and having Grayson there to help, kind of figure out what sort of care our students might need, our staff might need, the care Grayson himself might need, like working in partnership to figure out trans care in the academy. Also just gave me such a, healthy respect for the amount of work that is required in our institutions right now. And again, trying to build partnerships that can give us capacity is really important. But we're not going to get there if we don't also just like recognize, again, how fucking, impossible we are sometimes. Okay, comment, please.
So one thing I've been thinking about a lot lately in the context of the pandemic is like, how do you trauma bond without embodied interpersonal like contact with one another? And I think we see it in like what Jules called the great agora of social media, the great trans agora of social media. We see a certain degree of trauma bonding happening there that is not obviously sort of viscerally, right, embodied. But it's difficult to understand how trauma lives in the body, both your own and in other folks, if you can't actually witness and be involved, right, in a visceral and corporeal way with one another. And I don't just mean like sexually, although of course that's part of it. And I think when I think about witnessing and how it circulates amongst trans folks, a lot of that witnessing has to do with being able to identify how trauma lives in trans bodies and understanding that in a very, very intimate sort of like pre-cognitive, pre-verbal way, and then relating to one another with an acknowledgement of that is also often nonverbal. And and a lot of that has to do with the question of how we muffle our sensoriums in order to survive. Like I can see when I have a friend that sort of moves through a situation with downcast eyes or sort of hunches their shoulders in a conversation with one another. Like I understand maybe not specifically what's producing that, but I get it, right, pretty intimately. And I also have attempted to devise ways to sort of have dialogue through that obvious sort of like physical manifestation of defensiveness, and like totally justified lack of trust in a situation. I think one thing that I've tried to write about in the book and that I'm often preoccupied with is just the radical lack of trust that so many trans folks have in any social situation, including social situations that are majority trans. Sometimes those are even more stressful, right? Because you're like worried about whether you're doing it right, whether you're making a bad impression, whether, I don't know. So yeah. And I guess I kind of want to stop there. That feels like a natural sort of end point, and maybe other folks want to speak to that. But yeah, the way the trauma lives in the body, and also how we work with that collectively, how we can develop tools to work with that collectively, and how we do already, just in our sort of person-to-person relationships, and how that's what's missing for so many of us right now.
Super briefly, and if we want to, I don't know if we're going to switch to Q&A time or, but as a bridge, like I think one of the things that your book testifies to, right, is a lot of the behaviors that, or a lot of the things that trans people do to get by and cope, and we kind of fight over amongst ourselves, are actually just reactions to transphobia, right? So like 99% of passing is really just like transphobia makes you want to pass because like, I don't know, like that's like the most reasonable assumption you could ever make, right? And I think transphobia is what transphobia is what makes us dissociate. Transphobia is what makes us go into protective, reactive states of panic and depression. it's not like we don't know that, but there's something so hard in reminding yourself that over and over and over again. In my fun catalog of 2020, I also had like a really bad resurgence of PTSD this summer, and went into EMDR therapy for the first time. And like, it was really hard. Like, it was really hard to feel that embarrassed. I mean, I was also alone. So that was like this wild experience of care where I made my call list, and, I was, sort of flipping through people every day and calling them, but I started to become so incredibly embarrassed that I, call and be like, you're not going to believe this. And it's so shameful, but I'm actually still traumatized like I was a week ago. Like, I haven't gotten better. And it was like so hard for me to deal with that and think about that. And the whole time I was like, oh, thank goodness it's summer, and thank goodness it's a pandemic. And, even I didn't realize how much terrible shame I sort of carried about, was carrying around in my body. But once I really started to think about that, I was like, right, well, one of the biggest contributing factors is just transphobia, because otherwise the pandemic has been, for someone like me, for a trans woman of color, just like the nicest part about it for me is that I just am not like looked at very often. That's like been amazing. I mean, and I control how I'm looked at in my home. I control how I'm looked at on Instagram, and I love it. So I think there's yeah, I'm not sure where I thought I was going with that. But I do think that it's helpful to remind ourselves rather that yeah, our shortcomings and our inconsistencies are not they're absolutely not political failings. They're also not moral failings. And they're actually mostly conditioned by structural antagonisms that are so insidious, they don't appear, right? Like, one of the reasons I think dysphoria is interesting is because I think we have no idea what dysphoria is. I mean, psychologists and doctors have done one, pass at it. But what's so incredible to me about dysphoria is one of the symptoms of dysphoria. I'm not using it in a pathological framework, but one of the ways you can have dysphoria is by not feeling that you have dysphoria. Like, that's a fucking, that's just like wild that can be true, right? And I think that, there are just so many, there are just so many instances where inventing a trans vocabulary, right, is about creating a way of giving meaning to actual phenomenological experience in the world that is so sort of rooted on a substratum of transphobia that we don't even know when it's happening to us, right? Like, that's the thing that happens sometimes. And that's why I think T for T is so interesting too, especially across genders, because it's not about being like, oh, thank goodness you're trans and I'm trans, so like we get everything. It's not even that at all. It's like you were saying, it's that, oh, I know what that face means. I know what that kind of hug is about. I know what those kinds of tears are about, even though I don't. And there's a different kind of ethos, right? When you can understand that you care for someone without trying to possess their interior. And there's an incredible, yeah, I think there's a way in which also, sorry, I'm ranting, but that there's something about like modern governmentality, right? That has implanted in us the desire to be invaded, right? There's a relief in saying, I don't even want to be a subject. Please control me and govern me, right? I mean, that is the heart of fascism that Foucault talks about and Deleuze and Guattari talk about, right? Why do people love authoritarians so much? Why is so much of this country a bunch of fascists, right? Even if it's not in their best interest, it's because they want it. They feel it right in there, right? And there's so many things that we have had implanted in us, no matter how much work of deprogramming and collective care we've done. And I think that one thing that's just so incredible to think of trans studies as contributing to, and that this book is really showing us, is that we can dig and dial into those unsymbolizable or non-verbal, components of the mundane that actually are really high stakes. It's your nervous system, right? Like, it's whether you get out of bed or not. It's whether you can leave the house or not. It's whether you can go to work or go to class. It's whether you can, continue to get by just enough to survive or lose whatever meager resources have been sent your way through no fault of your own, right? So I think there's something really interesting about how the mundane is simultaneously de-dramatizes the stakes of trans life, because I'm really tired of trans life be narrativized as life or death, I actually think that does a lot of damage to trans people, because it means some people don't exist. They are just there for death. Trans women of color there's no curiosity about them from anyone in the world. They only exist to be tragic figures. And now, we're watching this sort of battle over trans kids where, the progressive wing is going to try and lift up the most rosy-cheeked cherubic children because they're worthy of life, right? I mean, it's a terrible, terrible false dichotomy. I think if anything, being trans teaches you that life and death are not opposites, right? And I think that's exactly one of the biggest lessons of this book that I just find so immensely moving that it's causing me to go on long rants about it over and over.
I loved it so much, though. I mean, and I think I was struck when you said that dysphoria is actually interesting, right? I think I agree. Dysphoria is extremely interesting if we sort of if we refuse the pathologization of it, or if we refuse the medicalized nomenclature, and actually think about it along the model that Anne proposes in the book on depression, right? As a specifically political phenomenon. And I think before we open up for Q&A, which we probably should do soon, I just wanted to note that I think that Trans Care is a book. Its main project was to sort of think about how trans folks are already disinvested in questions of social reproduction and doing work that is about sort of reinventing the social. And that is fundamentally, right, mutual aid work. So maybe we can turn to this still really big audience and hear from some folks.
Yeah, I'm happy to post some questions from our Q&A. And I just like to remind everybody, I am trying to check the chat, but I'm getting to your questions mostly through the Q&A. So if you wouldn't mind funneling all questions through that. Also, if your hand's up, if you could also funnel your question through Q&A, that would be great. Okay, so you all, this has been amazing. And there's been quite a few questions. So I'll just get started. Let's see here. This was a really interesting one. So this is from your friend, Chris Hil. On page 40, Hil writes, an ethos emerges from an ensemble of practices. When we shift from collective practice, we reconfigure ethos. Practices of care are always part of an emergent ethos because care isn't abstract, but only ever manifested through practice, action, labor, work. It is integral to our ways of doing. So Chris asks, I was wondering if you might talk a bit more about reconfiguring ethos and how your thinking has shifted and expanded since writing this or in writing this. What does a reconfigured and emergent ethos mean, for example?
Yeah, so my first question is, which Chris is this?
This is Chris McLean.
Oh, hey, Chris. Okay, that's important to know. So not for personal reasons. So Chris, yeah, I think that my thinking about ethos actually did shift as I was writing the book. I've always been, my sort of background, not academic background, but political background is like, as a baby anarcho-punk during my teens, and have always been sort of committed to variously Marxist and anarchist modes of approaching questions of the political. So I've always been concerned with praxis, right? And praxis has always been sort of paramount. And what's been strange is that the more sort of academia absorbed my life, the more the sort of iterations of praxis that I had been familiar with in the context of activist work they just sort of ceased to make sense in an academic environment. So I've been thinking a lot just on the ground personally, right? If an ethos of care is specifically about labor, if it's specifically about the kind of work that we do, then I had like the set of personal questions that had to do with, well, what work was I doing that was informed by an ethos of care in my day-to-day life, given that so much of it, right, like 10 hours a day sometimes more, is just saturated with academic labor. And so that's a really personal question. And I think my answer to it comes out of the sort of like soul searching I've had to do in terms of thinking about how to cultivate an ethos of trans care in academia. One of the ways that I've been trying to do it is just to divert as much money as possible to trans academics, especially to early career trans academics. I'm junior myself, so I don't have, this is related to what Jules was saying, like I don't have a lot of resources to redistribute, but when I do, I try. And I think the other thing is, some of you, everybody that's here from Penn State probably knows this, but I I sort of, started and helped run a group called TFAGs, which stands for Transforming Feminist and Gender Studies. But I just wanted to call it TFAGs, and then I invented an acronym. So whatever, that maybe doesn't leave this room. It could get me in trouble with the sort of bigwigs in, our main administrative buildings. But yes. So I started that group in large part to just sort of foster trans scholarship and connections amongst not just trans students, trans graduate students, trans faculty members, although definitely them, but also to sort of just shine a light on emergent work in trans studies that's not getting a lot of sort of structural take-up in other quarters of the university, right? That's the case at Penn State. I'm not sure how it is at everybody else's institution. And a lot of my thinking about that, right, the diversion of resources, how to cultivate sort of resistant community, or maybe like fugitive community within academic spaces, is very, very much in debt to my mentor, Maria Jonas, who just really passed. But she spent her whole career trying to cultivate radical community in academic spaces that were extremely hostile to it, and was extremely successful, actually, I'd say, over the course of her life. And I was sort of lucky enough to be a part of those groups that ran with shoestring budgets, but actually facilitated conversations, emergent conversations on decolonial feminisms in the early 2000s, for instance, a group on men of color and masculinity studies that also happened around that time. She was constantly sort of developing these one-off groups and then trying to make them into long-term sustainable projects to provide space that otherwise wasn't offered intellectually. And also to provide sort of like career building opportunities for early career, multiply marginalized scholars. So that's personally, right, how I've been thinking about this question of ethos. But I think, the challenge, right, is to sort of keep the question of ethos paramount in all of our minds, especially for academics and inhabit institutions that love to do a lot of things and accomplish nothing, right? Love to have endless committees and meetings and ultimately accomplish nothing. Yeah, it's a challenge.
Okay, so there are a couple questions around the digital world, since we've already talked about the importance of care, online, Twitter, etc. So what are y'all's thoughts on how digital trans care is increasingly mediated by social media corporations, especially in the era of COVID? And kind of as a secondary question, what do you all think is the transformative aspect of a digital friendship, a friendship that takes place in these spaces?
I can take the lead on that, maybe. I mean, so many trans friendships start digitally and some of them stay that way forever. I mean, one of the things that I was starting to feel sad about after having lived in Pittsburgh for a few years, but being sort of put into the academic enclosure, right, by dint of moving here, and having a hard time meeting other people, was that I was like, I don't know a lot of trans women. That's really not good it's not good. It's just not good. I don't even have to explain why. That's just bad. And so I'd set, one of my many lofty goals for 2020 in January was to make a lot of trans women friends. And mercifully, I still have. It was in the great. I'm just making names for everything now. In the great, the great Lex wave of the first lockdown. I met a bunch of trans women on Lex, and many of whom I've never met in person, and that's lovely. But I do think that there is, this sort of question about how technologies of circulation and communication, obviously our surveillance technologies. I think that this is a problem that we face even in our teaching, right? My institution wanted me to record all of my class meetings, and I was like, no, I'm not going to record trans 18-year-olds talking in a literature class. That's the most terrible idea I've ever heard. Not to mention I'm already upset about the proprietary implications of all the software that we're using right now. So I mean, ditto that, right? It's oh, right, yeah. I mean, sometimes okay, let me just make a plea for always talking about race, basically, because I think that when trans politics or queer feminist politics get, sort of taken up on that in single access frames, they just make embarrassing mistakes, right? So earlier this year, when ICE put out that memo that basically all international students, unless they were attending class in person, would be would lose their student visa status, you know, it's like, okay, first, education, point one, lots of people don't know, student visas are handled by ICE directly. Point two, universities legally cannot intervene on your behalf or even give you advice or try to protect you. They can only implement Department of Homeland Security policy. Well, I know this because I was an international student, but yeah, you know, and one of the things that happened was, of course, you know, everyone went on Twitter and was like, I'll teach a fake dummy course. Like, you can come to my fake class, so I will make sure you can stay on campus. And then, you know, immigration activists were like, you know, now you actually can't do that because you said that, right? Because first of all, it would be like breaking immigration law, which would be the only pretext ICE needs to like get rid of all the students at your school. And also, you know, ICE is like on Twitter, right? Like, let's be real. First of all, they have a Twitter account. Made famous by when they were tweeting about their prison for trans women in the Southwest. It was just like, oof. But anyways, it was like one of those moments where it was like, hello people, like this is how the internet works, right? And sometimes we need those perspectives, I think, to hold on. On the other hand, like, I mean, God, like what else are we supposed to do right now? I think like, but there's a certain luxury to privatizing your life and then reconstructing some of it online. But, you know, I'll be really interested on how we reflect on this like in the future, which is not to minimize what we're going through right now, or the people who are sick. You know, losing people has been really hard, not being able to go to funerals, not being able to touch another person's body, you know, in mourning is just like one of the most profoundly painful things I've experienced. So there's a lot that, you know, the digital can't compensate for. And then this weird Zoom thing, right? Where it's like the entire world collapsed. And now I feel like I've been hanging out with everyone in trans studies all fall, and it's amazing. I'm also like, whew, we gotta like have less events, people. We are like working ourselves. It's my fault. You literally probably all seen me 100 times this fall on Zoom. I need to stop. I'm just telling myself. So I'm gonna stop talking right now.
Go ahead, Ann.
Oh, so much to say. But I love that this is conversational. I love that speaking of digital intimacy, I love that this event is one that has chosen to keep the chat going for these, you know, 200 plus people. I haven't liked the webinars where you don't know who's there and you don't see the chat. I mean, this is what we have, you know. Queers have always invented forms of intimacy. And so even though I'm old and like pre-digital, I like to stay as flexible as possible and figure out how to use different technologies. You know, we could talk about the archive that way too, like toss it or work it. And so I've been just really, really interested to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And there's no one formula, but small scale events with my queer kin have really kept me going. Black feminists have kept me going. I just want to like all hail to Alexis Pauline Gums, who's doing amazing digital community building that also has been very open to a range of people. So I have found her Black Feminist Breathing Chorus, which is a version of a digital class. Like they can be done well. That is tools for survival. And events like this. I have done digital oral histories with my generationally queer kin who are HIV/AIDS activists. So for Columbia, I've been doing interviews with Greg Bordowitz, Kendall Thomas, Giancarlo Musto. Those have also been a lifeline for me where we are thinking together in conversation, just like we're doing now. Like, what the fuck's going on? How can we use the lessons of the past? All that stuff. And yes, as I think Jules is suggesting, I mean, there's going to be so much, there are going to be so many parties to be had when we can get together again. Although I have a friend who did a digital lap dance birthday party and it was pretty good. And unresolved mourning. So we like, I mean, who knows what we'll be coming up with, but I I think there's a lot of grieving to be done of the sick, the dead, but also of things we've lost. Like, I'm sad about, that we didn't get together for ASA. Like, ASA is another, academic lifeline for me. And Douglas Crimp teaches me not to feel ashamed to grieve the small stuff. So in Mourning and Militancy, the lesson of getting to grieve having unprotected sex and not just having your friends die, like, we get to have that too. That is part of queer affect embrace. So I don't know, I'm just trying to, make shit up as I go along, but I have been really interested to track. I've been writing along public feelings lines, but trying to keep tabs on performance, like what works and what doesn't work in the digital environment, and also protest. Who's been on the streets, who's not. We know from disability justice work that we can't just prioritize being on the street. Being at home can also be a way to be active. And appreciate what Jules said also about the ways in which sometimes being in a digital environment actually allows for, more freedom or less self-consciousness about gender presentation or about microaggressions and so on. So it's a pretty interesting landscape if you can, keep yourself together enough, like healthy enough of body, spirit, and mind to stay connected with people. Just one other thing, someone in the chat mentioned this issue also of, which is very important to me. I just made a huge move that was a bit crazy, but also, soul journey of some kind to return to Canada after 30 years in Texas. I still I'm pretty fucked up about it. Who knew I would miss the South so much? But this academic diaspora, like how we are just, and all of the grad students I work with, the junior scholars, like the geographic dispersal and moving, if you're lucky, here for a postdoc, there for a fucking 10K, course or whatever it is, like that is definitely, I think, the geographic issues that are already there, and then the pandemic on top of that. That's another like really interesting issue for discussion, I think, about like our bodies and trauma and land and caretaking, and again, how do we make community with each other across the different times and spaces that we live in. Thank you for letting me say that.
So this has been absolutely fabulous, but we have only a couple more minutes. So it's up to the panelists. I can either throw out another question, or if there's another set of conversations that we can do in 2 minutes, but there are so many amazing questions. So for the folks that have been asking in the chat, please feel free to email me. I can send texts of the questions if you'd like to meditate on them to any of you. So I'm really happy to do that. But again, we have only a couple more minutes, so it's up to you three what you'd like to do.
Hil should close it out.
I guess, yeah. I kind of want to hear like one last question and then maybe respond quickly to it. And I want copies of all the questions and all the chats.
Happy to do it. Happy to do it. Okay, so this is no judgment on the quality of questions, but I thought this was a really interesting one for the last question. So this is a question. So as I listen to this brilliant conversation, I wonder if any of the speakers tonight would like to comment on the visibility of trans care and or trans labor in terms of aesthetics. Jules in particular has brought up how trans folks are or are not visible in particular circumstances. And so I wonder if in the same way one thinks through building a trans vocabulary or a vocabulary for trans subjectivity, you've thought this process in relation to the visual. How can we both create a language or vocabulary for care as well as a visual imaginary or trans aesthetics?
Yeah, so this is going to be hard to respond to in a minute or two. No, but I actually can say that I think that most of my thinking about trans aesthetics is probably in trans care in the section on the billboards, 3 billboards, abstraction, anonymity, and attention. And in that section, I think I was really trying to grapple with why it was that trans artists who sort of deal in the visual language of abstraction were producing work that I found infinitely more compelling than any of the sort of more, documentarian work, which is still extremely valuable, right? And in large part, I think it's because it resists the sort of, really violent economies of visuality that so many trans folks, and in particular trans women, and in particular trans women of color, are consistently subject to. So, and I quote Misha Cardenas specifically in a piece where she writes about light in relationship to like trans femme existence and visuality. And I would just direct people to that work. I think it's in Ada, which is an online journal. It's excellent. And the other thing that I want to know about trans aesthetics that I find compelling for obviously personal reasons is I really sort of like the jokey engagements that trans mass folks have with questions of height and questions of like datitude visually. And that's obviously because I'm like, what, I'm wearing an Ella Bean shirt right now. I have a #1 dad mug, so I'm into that. I think it is an aesthetic language that riffs on some of the more horrifying and kind of ugly aspects of white masculinity in particular, but deturns them in a sometimes compelling way. So yeah, but, oh, Jules.
Can I just add to that? Because I forgot to say this at a panel on aesthetics last week. Like so much of gender and sexuality is not identitarian. It's actually just aesthetic assemblage and expression. And I think this would be the one place to think about how trans here actually doesn't live in isolation. And to Ann's earlier point, right? Like modes of care, like modes of femme care for community or modes of butch femme care or other styles, other queer styles actually like show up through gendering as like aesthetic practice rather than identitarian, right? So there are, I'm a big fan of trans masked dad aesthetics, not for myself, in others. And yeah, I think that there's so much more to be said actually about, and then there's not like all this concern about, are you a lesbian or it's like, it doesn't matter. These are just aesthetic styles. And then we can have critiques of how like white non-binary androgyny aesthetics like are, doing a thing and blah, blah, blah. But anyways, I just wanted to jump on that. So
well, we're a little over time, so I just want to sort of publicly thank Jules and Ann and Aaron for facilitating, and all of the folks that came out. It's like a beautiful gathering of people. And I can't wait to be in embodied person-to-person relationship with all of you one day soon, hopefully.
Yeah, I wanted to thank all of you. Thank you so much, Ann and Jules and Hil, for being so generous with your time. And this has just been fantastic. Please take a look at the chat. It's incredible. Again, for everybody that's been asking, this is being recorded. We'll post it on the Rock Ethics Institute website after the fact. If you want any transcripts of questions, you can always email me, and we'll also send you all a follow-up email with all this information. So please join me in thanking everyone, and buy Trans Care as soon as you can if you haven't already, or buy your 3rd copy. Thanks, everybody. It's been a joy.